Ukraine needs more money. Now hear me out. I just did an intensive breakdown on why Ukraine's actually being underfunded. The West has a moral obligation and a right to fund Ukraine because we forced them in 1994 to give up their nuclear weapons to Russia. We forced them to give up about 1,800 nuclear weapons and give them to Russia. I actually want to do more research and more videos and more articles on this topic because I find it really interesting that the narrative in the mainstream media is that we've written them a blank check, that the West, Europe, and the United States, Canada, has written Ukraine a blank check. They're super funded. We're giving them so much money. But in reality, 90% of the money the US is giving Ukraine, 90% of that, or close to 90%, is not going to Ukraine at all. Almost none of it is directly going to Ukraine. Around $135 billion is actually going directly to US defense companies. So we're giving them stockpiled weapons or old weapons, Vietnam era, Gulf War era weapons. And then we're rebuilding them, rebuilding those weapons, rebuilding those weapon systems, and giving them to ourselves. I haven't heard a single news outlet talk about this, and it's absurd. There's this idea that we're giving Ukraine billions of dollars and it's not being used correctly. But in reality, the billions of dollars that we're giving them are going to US companies, US-based NGOs, USAID. So the money laundering that's taking place in Ukraine is on the American side, is on the Western side. It's not on the Ukrainian side. I'm sure there's some going on in Ukraine. I'm sure that is also true. But the majority of it is happening on the US and Western alliances side, because we're saying we're giving them $200 billion. We've committed, the US has committed, I think right now, $188 billion, $187 billion based on ukraineoversight.gov. And this breaks it down. And I'll throw this up on screen. 126 of that goes to the DOD. 39.5 of that went to USAID, which Trump really shut down. 12.2 billion of that went to the State Department, and 8.5 billion of that went to other. It just says other. If that's not money laundering on the US Western side, I don't know what is. There's this idea that we're giving them all this money. Also, this money is only about 50% of it has actually gone through. Only about we've committed this amount. Only about 50% of this has actually gone through. This says status of appropriated funds as of June 30th, 2025. Only 94 billion of it has actually been dispersed, and 90% of that only went to US defense companies, US-based NGOs, USAID. It says 60 billion of that has been obligated, not yet dispersed. 30 billion of that has been appropriated, but not yet dispersed. And somehow 3.6 billion of it was either expired or other. $3.6 billion, other. $8.5 billion, other. These are huge numbers. 1 billion is 1,000 millions. $1 million could fit on this table. $1 billion would take up half of this room. 8.5 billion of it is listed as other. One of the reasons that I say Ukraine needs more money is because of these facts that I'm presenting to you. And the same is true on the European Western side. They're actually not giving them all that cash. Right now, I believe Ukraine is trying to get cash so that they can fund their war, but it's in the form of a debt. So they're trying to take out billions in loans to fund this war and protect themselves from the Russian invasion that's been going on for 4 years now. The anniversary of that war was a couple days ago. This war has kind of been going on for 1,400 and about 70 days. What I find so concerning, and why I wanted to make this video and do this research, is because I follow a lot of people on the front lines. I communicate with a lot of people that are on the front lines in different units, in different divisions, in different brigades. And almost every single brigade is raising money. Almost every single brigade has to raise money to get critical weapon systems and defensive systems and offensive systems to protect themselves and fund their brigade. Last year, a lot of brigades, this guy Preston Stew, I think, raised around $770,000 for different brigades, which is great work by him. He has a YouTube channel and Instagram. He does some fantastic dialogue on this, and he's been over there a couple times as well. But Ukraine needs more money. We have this donor fatigue in the US because we've been fed this narrative that they are been given a blank check, they're taken care of, they don't need any more money. But in reality, the reality is actually the complete opposite. And so much of the narrative in the US too is that Ukraine is corrupt, that Ukraine is a money laundering operation. And it kind of is, but in the US it is, not in Ukraine. And that's what needs to be talked about. That's the dialogue that we need to have. But the mainstream news doesn't even cover any of this. They don't cover anything meaningful anymore. It's like random monologues on politics. It's random commentary on politics in the US, and it's exhausting. And I just did a little video about this. They all require subscriptions to read their articles. Some of them actually create really good articles and really good in-depth research, but they just post it to their site. They don't talk about it on TV. They don't talk about it on YouTube. They just post it to their site. And then, like The Economist, you have to pay $290 a year to access their website. And they still run ads. So there's this insane narrative that the US has like given a blank check to Ukraine, when in reality, we barely given them anything. So I was thinking about the Ukraine-Russia war. And it's one of the first wars in my lifetime where a global power is invading another country. Besides, obviously, the US war on terror, where the US invaded the Middle East for 20 years. And I was thinking about how I could compare the US war on terror to the Ukraine-Russia war. And I was thinking about the money behind them. So the US spent about $8 trillion in the global war on terror. Around 2 million of that was spent directly on warfighting expenses. And I was thinking about how you can compare the two wars. And what I came to the conclusion of was the cost of war, which goes into the cost to eliminate the enemy, right? And so in the global war on terror, it costs the US approximately $4 to $6 million to eliminate a single insurgent. $4 to $6 million based on the $2 million spent for direct warfighting cost. It costs $4 to $6 million to eliminate a single insurgent. In Ukraine, Russia, based on the direct warfighting expenses, it is costing roughly $300,000 to $600,000, and I would argue less. Ukraine is fighting this war extremely efficiently. They are using $400 FPV drones to eliminate a Russian soldier. So roughly, it's probably costing them less than $300,000. But based on these numbers, based on the same calculations, for the global war on terror and the Ukraine-Russia war. Global war on terror was $4 to $6 million. Ukraine-Russia is $400,000 to $600,000. That is an insane bargain that the US Department of War could probably never hit those numbers. The US Department of War is so inefficient that it could probably never fight a war and eliminate an enemy for that little amount. In terms of lethality per dollar spent, Ukraine outperforms historical Pentagon benchmarks by a factor approaching 8 to 1. These are insane numbers. This is the most efficient war ever fought against a global hegemon. You might have to go back to like Native Americans because they didn't spend any money. You might have to go back that like super far in order to find a war where there was an equal amount spent. Certainly not any war recently has ever performed this efficiently against a global power like Russia. So like I was saying earlier, most of this aid facilitates the transfer of older stockpiles such as decades old Bradley fighting vehicles that were already incurring maintenance or decommissioning costs for US taxpayers. So most of the weapons and older vehicles that we're giving to Ukraine were costing taxpayers money. So we're just spending the money to send it to Ukraine. Say, hey, figure it out. Try to get this running. You can use this, but it doesn't run. Try to get it running. And then at the same time, that aid budget funds the procurement of brand new vehicles for the US, of brand new equipment for the US to replenish and modernize America's own military. So most of the money already spent shouldn't be aid that was given to Ukraine, because that's not what it is. It's Pentagon budget to replenish American stockpiles, to build new modern weapons. That's what this aid is. It's not money given to Ukraine. Something that also should be noted is that Russia has essentially shifted to a full-scale war economy. Their military expenditure is climbing to well over 150 billion, probably 170 to 280 $280 billion. So $500 million a day essentially is what they're spending, which is equivalent to 7% of their GDP. So they're shifting to a full-scale war economy, spending close to $280 billion a year, while Ukraine is being drip-fed funds in like super old equipment. What Russia is now spending a year is what the US has committed for 4 years, $187 billion, with only $94 billion of that being actually dispersed to date. The US has given Ukraine $94 billion over 4 years, and Russia is spending $280 billion a year on the higher end for their war efforts. This is the most efficient war ever fought in modern history. And it is reshaping and redefining how wars will be fought going forward. With this drone warfare and drone capabilities and drone technology, that Ukraine is actually, each unit is modifying their drones for their needs, is modifying them on a daily basis. They send them out, they say, hey, fix this, hey, add this to these drones because this is what we need. And then they do that. That's unheard of. It takes months, years for large countries like Russia, and it's why Russia is struggling, but for large countries like Russia, China, the US, to reshape and remake weapons based on what they need at the front lines. And you see that throughout history, throughout the global war on terror. The military strategy was so wrong, and it took years to change. And even then, they failed to change adequately. So this donor fatigue equated to the Ukraine-Russia war, equated to what the West is funding for Ukraine, is based on a false reality. It's not based on reality at all. It's based on Western propaganda and this like illusion of a blank check being written for Ukraine. And then I wrote here that if policymakers in 2001 could have foreseen the opportunity to achieve the near total erosion of Russia's conventional military capabilities for a mere $350 billion without a single NATO soldier or US soldier lost in direct combat, which isn't really true because NATO soldiers and US soldiers have been noted in Ukraine, especially CIA and Western intelligence operatives. But that's not public and that's not like confirmed. Most strategists would have deemed it the bargain of a century. And even today, I'm sure strategists who are unwilling to go public would deem giving more money to Ukraine would be a bargain unseen before in history. Ukraine is undertaking the brutal high-cost labor of safeguarding Western security interests at a fraction of the price attached to prior US-led wars. Halting support now would not constitute prudent fiscal stewardship. It would amount to forsaking the single most cost-effective investment in global stability and deterrence that history has yet produced. This is why Ukraine needs more funding. This is why Ukraine needs Western support. Now, there was an interesting article from The Economist about Putin trying to persuade Trump to end his war by granting US-based companies and the US in general like this $12 trillion business package, which is really interesting, and it might be beneficial for the US to take. But I think in the long run, and I think based on the fragile system of US diplomacy right now, it would be detrimental to the US and the US Western hegemon power to take that business package, that business deal, because the US in 1994, based on the Budapest Memorandum, agreed with the UK, with NATO, with Western countries to protect Ukraine if it gave up its nuclear weapons. And if the US falls back on that, I think it'll be brutal for any diplomacy and any negotiating power the US has going forward with any country, because it would prove that the US doesn't stick to its word. The deals that the US make, it doesn't uphold, which is why Ukraine needs more funding now.